We are going to begin. Welcome to the academic conference Safeguarding the Freedom of Press within in the context of insecurity. So this is carried out in the commemoration of World Day of Freedom of Press by UNESCO, and the 2024 conference will be held in Santiago. We have the Communications and Image faculty and also Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Without further ado, welcome everyone. So I would like to remind you that those that are going to ask any questions to the presenters need to write that in some papers that are in the hands of our colleague, and you can provide that to him, Matias. And at the end of the session, we will be asking these questions. I would like to remind you that we will have five presentations. Each presentation will last up to 10 minutes, and I will let them know when they have 3 to 1 minutes and when they need to finish their presentation. The first presentation will be in charge of the Mexican professors that are connected via Zoom, and the rest will be in person. So we are going to start the risks associated to digital environment. And we will begin with the presentation, understanding the digital violence against journalists and which factors explain the prevalence of speech, hate speech, and the desensitization of the public opinion, carried out by Mireya Marquez and Giselle Salazar. Good morning, everyone. I think that you can see my presentation already. And first of all, thank you so much. I'm sorry for not being here today in person, but we are going to make our biggest effort in order to share the idea of our presentation remotely. So we are studying violence against journalists in the way of hate speech, and this phenomenon that has been called in several ways digital violence, hate speech. This is just a speech way that has increased significantly in all countries around the world, not only in democracy, as we can see those in Latin American countries, but also in advanced democracies. But this in particular has been presented in a more accentuated manner in politically polarized environments or that are under populist regimes. So literature has identified the profiles of journalists that are most probable to face this type. And we're talking about women and minorities. However, even though we have all this progress in literature, there is a conceptual misunderstanding regarding this phenomenon. And we don't have comparative studies that allow us to understand the risk factors and vulnerabilities in the face of different aggressions. So we used as a case study Mexico, which is the country that tops the lists of countries that have more aggressions against the press. So we are talking about the more than 500 attacks. And according to the results of the third round of the World of Journalism study, which we based our study on, more than 55% of the 443 journalists have faced some sort of aggression in digital spaces. So, this digital environment with this is manifested more frequently, and we see more of hate speech. So, why we need to focus in journalists as victims of this type of violence? Because journalists have an active voice and an opinion. They are visible and they have a constant presence in social media. As you know, their profession is a critical, and this is also going against the political opinions. And also countries that have more prevalence of violence against the press, they have more of this type of violence, which makes us understand and to put into context the prevalence of hate speech. We cannot isolate journalists of more widened aspects, and we talk about the consequences, censorship, the dismotivation to talk about other topics, and erosion of this type of work. So thank you. Good morning, everyone. And we have a lot of gaps of knowledge when it comes to hate speech because the hate speech has been addressed from a literature in terms of psychological aspects on hate speech within trolling, adolescence, cyberbullying, and also there is literature that is only addressing hate speech against the journalists, politicians, and others. So we need to establish a dialogue between those literatures, and there is a lot of conceptual dispersion of the concept. We don't measure this in the same way due to hate speech. We're measuring aggressions, and as Grisel mentioned as well. And once again, we have a lot of terms to refer to this. We're talking about cyber hate, digital violence, censorship. So for journalists, we see digital harassment. And it's not the label what is important, but this concept, when we see the surveys or we see the variables that we use to measure this, we see that there are many types of aggressions, insults, doxing, surveillance, harassment, and others. So for this literature, it's been difficult to isolate hate speech per se. And on the other side, qualitative studies tend to focus on those groups that we believe are victims of hate speech, particularly women. And curiously, we have found that there is no literature or very little literature for LGBTQ. And the culture of journalists tend to focus on the protection mechanisms, the effects of resiliency. So what we want to do is to model, well, this is going to be essentially our concept and the ones that we see in meta-analysis of literature: violent language, aggressive or offensive one, focused on a specific group of people that share a good or a common identity, and this could be done through internet and social media. And also this is repeated systematically and motivated by ideologies. And briefly, literature tells us what are the factors that are associated to victimization. The only thing that they are telling us that it is a very sparse manner. So never in the same study. So we have studies that are talking about structural violence. We're talking about hate speech that is generated from the state or from groups of power and from, or that is a result of the political polarization from party or conservative groups. And on the other side, we see the predictors or factors that are individual and that are most probable to receive hate speech. We're talking about sexual minorities, women, or to be part of a minority community, could be ethnic or religious one. Also, if we use the literature is about being on social media for extended periods or to be an intermediary, you can also receive hate speech. The position of the journalistic work, if you're visible, some studies say that you are more probable to receive hate speech. And of course, there are some studies that have controlled in their studies for work and professional variables, if they have support, what type of perception of the roles they have. So our investigation questions are the following one. First, how hate speech will affect Mexican journalists in relation to other types of aggression. And as we said, it is necessary to separate this type of violence from others because we believe that hate speech has dynamic logics that are only related to that. What are the individual, organizational, and society factors that are influencing victims of hate speech, and what is, so we have the methodology, and our study is based on a national survey that was applied in Mexico. A representative one was strategized in four regions and four types of media: TV, radio, printing, and digital media. for 143 Mexican journalists. And this study is part of a global project, which is the world of journalism. As I said, our dependent variable is a hate speech, which was captured in the question in the last 5 years with which frequency you suffer some type of these events as a consequence of your work. We're talking about insults, hate speech that is addressed to you, and answers that go from never and to very often. As independent factors, we have 114 that were associated to different levels. So, first, when we see professional and characteristics of work. Second, the environment of work practices environment, and then social context and political context. So, these variables, we have a 67 on the first level, 88 of the second level, and 59 for the next level. So, the variables that are related to individual are talking about the identity of the journalist, political incline, type of contract experience, and others, and professional are related to the ethical practices, the journalistic roles, influences on the journalism practices, and then context. These are taxing information, level of corruption, level of trust, among others. And out of this, our strategy for analysis was to run a frequency tables in order to answer our first question. As you may know, is about how hate speech is impacting Mexican journalists. We carried out a descriptive analysis, and for the second question that talks about the prevailing factors, we have the control variables for the three levels of analysis. Evidently, we did not have all the variables that are statistically significant. We have 23 variables that were significant for our study, and we run three regression models. So first, about the individual level for 13, then we have professional level, 7 variables, and the third related to context and social environment with three that were significant. And in order to detect these predictors, we have a final regression that included these three levels at the same time. You have only 1 more minute. Well, thank you. For our first finding, we have 76 of journalists and three words of this type of journalist experiment this frequently, and the insults and hate speech are the biggest aggression that Mexican journalists receive. And in our work, we found in our regression models, essentially those in orange, that the individual factors are the ones that showed more significantly statistically significant predictors, and also to be part of a gender group, a gender aspects, or to work on TV. Those were predictors only when we got them together, and the professional dimensions and societal as well through some significant predictors, even though they were less. And if the journalist believes that it is important to have necessary information for opinion elaboration, and that became really significant. And also, the only variable that was statistically significant for society is the degree of social polarization. So when we have a society that has a third part, that has some part of their population living in extreme poverty, and the other side that lives in extreme wealthness. And next one. And just to finish, as we said, the results show that being part of a minority, to be part of social media, to work on TV, and the polarization of societies are the most important predictors for hate speech. The public opinion is also impacting male journalists and sexual minorities, which work is related to expose public powers and to create public opinion. And as a conclusion, if you want to, well, quickly, Our findings are going to confirm what literature says. Minority communities to have high visibility, to use frequently social media, and to have a relationship professionally with political coverage and digital media are elements that are proof to the Mexican case. And also, as we said, when we have a role of contribution to public opinion, but we also found that if the journalist is trying to show a favorable image to a public powers, that is also protecting them from hate speech. And finally, our study in some way is showing that women are not the victims of this type of hate speech. That means that when they receive this type of aggressions, is not severe or it does not have particular characteristics, but it tends to be the male that have more probability to suffer hate speech. And we know that those journalists that are prevailing in this context could be more inclined to have that, but we see the need to continue studying hate speech in a more empirical manner, considering the conditions that are surrounding the journalistic work. And this is the main thing that we would like to show for a study. Context is important. The development of societies and the political characteristics that are surrounding this and the polarization are one of the elements that were not included in previous studies for hate speech, and as we saw in the statistical analysis, are affecting the frequency of receiving this type of aggression. So here you can see the website where we can find some more information about the survey that we applied, and thank you so much for your attention.
We would like to thank you for the interesting results that you present to us. And now we will listen to the presentation Paradoxes of Freedom of Expression in Digital Environments from Martin Becerra and Silvio Weisbord. Good day, good afternoon, good night. Thank you for this invitation. I am Martin Becerra. Silvio Weisbord is here in spirit, but we will present what we have written together. That in part I am going to read it to be able to stay within the time frame that I have been assigned. We work on some of the paradoxes of thought regarding freedom of expression and the tradition of freedom of expression in digital environments. And we basically say, regarding the analysis of these paradoxes in a changing environment, a new order worldwide of information and communication that places in question the perspectives historically of whether it be classic, we call it million theories, started by John Stuart Mill, as well as those having to do with the 20th century, with authors like Loretti and Lozano, that they call universalist paradigms regarding freedom of expression. There are quite a few deficits when we talk about this as a right, as a guarantee in digital environments. The high circulation of false news, all these different disinformation by political organizations or private companies, or intentional misinformation of data of different groups that reject science as an institution, and you also that are also against those professionals and experts in other areas as well. In our work, we developed a criticism to the editorial function of the different platforms, the digital platforms, have an editorial publication role that is much more and more active through censorship or algorithm censorship, or that which is operated directly by the decision of the platform management. They have blocking, content moderation, and the algorithm programming, which in essence is content addition, because it determines what the priority is, the place and the higher or lower exposition of content, graphic elements that come along with those contents, the repetition, the warnings, the tagging, the hashtags that eventually come with these contents talk about edition or publication strategies of these contents, and there are private censorships as well. In the tradition of freedom of expression, and especially in the tradition of freedom of expression in the inter-American system of human rights, there is a discussion, a long discussion regarding the faculty or not of private companies, not only institutions in the state institutions, to create have censorship. In our work, we carry out development of why we consider that, and there's also jurisprudence in different countries in our region regarding if the censorship characteristic that this kind of intervention could have regarding, in this case, from the digital platforms, with some qualities that we know, like for example, being discretion, vulneration. So this activity is carried out in a way that is not clear. At the same time, something that we have to consider when we carry out the freedom of expression in digital environments has to do with the inequality of resources that individuals have, organizations have, and social players in the public area. For example, maximization of expression of one voice in particular that is particularly powerful, whether it be a state or private voice, it limits intervention of other players, and that causes phenomena that clearly affect democratic principles, fundamental human rights, for example, freedom of expression. So, in this sense, we have a big part of the thought of Owen Feast regarding how inequality in material and also affect the exercise of expression. It's not only the expression of who says something, but who also listens, who also talks about it, who understands, who's being informed, and all of those who are involved in this activity. And the double dimension, individually and socially, of the right of expression, and the narrative that has content, which is day to day in the programming of the algorithm and the feeds and the digital platforms. So basically, that requires a reflection regarding the needs, convenience, and logistics when those, as they were talking recently from Mexico about the impact of the perception that journalists in Mexico have regarding online violence. Behind that, there is a reflection regarding legitimate limits that expression can have in digital environments. So this expression is absent, this reflection, socially speaking, in our society, in Latin America at least, it does not have a coherent development yet. And the principle of free flow that basically says that public issues resolve themselves with more information is originated in a world of a scarcity of communication. It was a lot. It was long ago in the 19th century, and today that principle can be discussed in context of abundance of production, where the key elements of the productive chain of communication, information, entertainment, as the publication and distribution and exhibition platforms are, they are so concentrated with all of these things. So what we went from an historical context in which the vertical integration of the production chain of information and content was concentrated in a scarce amount of organizations who had the production means and communication means were just a few individuals or organizations. And now we are in a context of abundance in the chain link that has to do with the production of content, but with higher concentration in this chain of the publication, exhibition, distribution of those contents. So there is a problem there that touches the nerve of the standards regarding freedom of expression. Therefore, the digital platforms in the current context are part of numerous studies and legal regulations in Europe, and they are gatekeepers of the public space. And this takes to a new environment that is has to do with the separation of the producers of content and distributor, exhibitor, those who exhibit these content. And that what we were saying regarding the platforms before, it finds in the American content, not in Europe, due to the tradition having to do with human rights versus privacy. Basically, human rights versus privacy. Some obstacles that I believe are very well represented in this famous section 230 of the law having to do with communications in the United States, because the main headquarters of the social media is in the United States. They adopt this principle as something to be canonized, and they order the activity of these platforms around the world without the rest of the world participating in the writing of a section that has to do with the norms and regulations that is something for the United States and was written and normed before the massification of internet and before the different platforms of internet. So there is problems there. There's questioning, and especially over the last decade, post Snowden, because that was 2013. That changes the analytics 3 years later. But after that, there is effectively questioning, and there's a myth regarding competition that in the end the truth will triumph when we inject more. Like basically, more is better, more amount of information, more amount of content in the environments of having to do with socialization, and that will cause the truth to triumph basically. And there is a myth. I don't want to come against anybody. I know I won't do it. There is a neutrality regarding the status quo, lack of attention of inequalities, and even when the access of production platforms content is higher, the absence of reflection regarding main character role that the platforms have in the areas that I've been mentioning previously, it reveals neutrality regarding that status quo, and there is censorship that has as an exclusive attribute the state, and is usually not thought about in terms of the market, and problems in which the counter discourse cannot be resolved, and a big part of the contradictions in the exercise of the freedom of expression versus other rights like dignity, privacy, uh, data protection, etc. So our work basically is pointing in that direction to discuss that maximization of the freedom of expression, that truth will triumph and that we can have more healthy environments. And we propose some reflections regarding the contradictions that I mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this presentation. And next, we are going to hear the presentation of Legal Defense of Journalists in Costa Rica from Maria Teresa Garrido. Good morning. Well, good afternoon already. Thank you so much for being here. Before starting, I would like to ask you a very simple question. Do we have attorneys here? Two, three. And the rest, I believe, are related to social communication. Have you ever been involved in a legal procedure? One, as a victim. Two, three. So for me, this is very important. I'm an attorney, but I have been working for a long time on a legal protection for journalists. And this is something about how we can create bridges in order to understand one another, to speak the same language. So the legal defense of journalists in Costa Rica, and I would like to start here. How many of you have been in Costa Rica? We have some. And what do you know, Costa Rica? Coffee. Coffee is life, and life is in coffee. So that is the paradox. In Costa Rica, we live in agriculture, but this is a country that is also known by the promotion and defense of human rights and also environmental rights. And that's why we see these two pictures, an iguana, a monkey. If you go to beaches in Costa Rica, you will see nature, and that is part of the general culture of the country. And also, we are here, University for Peace, and Costa Rica is one of the countries that do not have an army, and that is why we have a development on how we can protect freedom of speech and human rights in general. We are part of the United Nations, and we were created with this vision of we're going to learn and we are going to design what is peace. How can we transform thinking, and how we can transform lives, changing this paradigm, not only to study conflict, not only seeing the problem, but we are thinking about the solutions as well. And this is one of the MO in Costa Rica. If you see the general standards of protection, is the best country in Central America when it comes to freedom of speech. But now, Journalists Without Borders increased the classification from 23 to 26. We continue being the country that protects the most here in the region. So when we talk about protection of journalists in Costa Rica, because the resources are going to countries such as El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Mexico, which is where we have the highest levels of journalists that are harassed, killed, displaced. And Costa Rica is in this protection environment, but how effectively, what type of violations are we seeing in Costa Rica? And from there is where we create the project that I would like to present today for legal assistance to journalists. One of the things, that we have elections in democratic countries, that there is turnover. And one of the proposals that we have from the university is to see what will happen with the protection of journalists in a society that is highly democratic, where normally we don't have a confrontation in terms of politics that will lead to a polarization, that journalists have the type of attacks and threats that we know are happening in the rest of the world when we have elections. So, UNESCO has a proposal of a global media defense fund, and we are going to apply that with the creation of an office for legal assistance for journalists in the framework of elections. So we said we have 23 candidates on a general elections of 2022. So that means a really big challenge for political journalism. We can have a big polarization that were very conservative parties, traditional new parties. And we said we are going to see what type of cases indeed can we find. And these are the results that I would like to share with you today. So, first of all, we see protection. So, who are we protecting? Journalists. So, we have journalists as any person that is exercising communication. No, that opens the possibility to have influencers, YouTubers, or bloggers, journalists of investigation, political journalists, sport journalists. We had a bit of everything. And this call that was very extended to have a big definition of who were the objects of protection. We had different alliances, and here alliances were key in order to reach these numbers of 15 journalists assessed, legal assessed. So when we see the number of journalists and attorneys are very, very small. So we need to create this union mechanisms where we see people exercising communication can go to the union to receive legal support, but I can go to a school of attorneys in order to receive help. And many of our work was to create these bridges, and starting from that point we were able to create different alliances with the School of Attorneys of Costa Rica, the School of Journalists in Costa Rica, and different communications media. So following the dynamic of what our colleagues from Mexico said, we have this narrative that women are the most threatened, the ones that have a bigger level of violence. And what we see through defense is that men are the ones that go to this type of procedure. And as colleagues said, it doesn't mean that women are not threatened. It doesn't mean that the situation is better for women. However, it shows that there is a difference in terms of the narrative, that who are the people that effectively are going to get close to a legal assistance office in order to receive that support. We have 12 men from Costa Rica and 3 women. So I'm not going to show the details of each one of the cases because we don't have the time, but I would like to stop in two things. First, we talk about defamation. Defamation is currently, and we talked about this, we're talking about the slaps, we talk about the use of legal mechanisms in order to start silencing journalists. So we're not talking only about traditional defamation. We have a financial investigation, there is an administrative investigation, and they start using the legal system of the country to start silencing journalists. And in Costa Rica, that is not an exception. This is a highly democratic country with a level of human rights protection that is very high, and also that has a separation of powers that is a very established, where the legal power has been outstanding in order to protect journalists. However, we see how politicians and people associated to the government, and even the population in general, are using the figure of defamation just to defy those contexts, that sometimes just because they don't like them, because they are being so critical, that I just want to silence them. In other cases, we have defamation, and that is also part of the investigation that we've carried out. But there is a very particular case that started in 2018. Marlon Bora, a journalist that was the editor of the program in which one of the girls, this is a university media, and the program was for students, by students. All the production was hand in hand with the students. And one student started to talk about a presidential candidate in that time, and the candidate presented a defamation process. The presenter of that program made some public apologies. He withdrew the process, but that continued with the editor, Marlon Mora. So the case was decided in 2022, and in that case, it was determined that he was a co-responsible for defamation, and they were sent a 60 million of colones for civil reparations. The sentence are 100 of pages, and this was published in a newspaper. The cost of the publication of a complete entire investigation and sentence, and he decided to defy this sentence, and that is why we started providing support for this appeal case. So how we can reach this second instance to effectively demonstrate that defamation first is extremely personal. The editor had no control of this, the way in which the procedure was carried out, and this is highly questioned, and this case is still pending for decision. This is an interesting case that has a potential of changing everything that is happening in Costa Rica, but that shows us how this interference of defamation becomes complex. So this is not the only thing that we have been doing. We have talked to journalists in exile because Costa Rica has received a big number of journalists from Nicaragua that are seeing how they can reintegrate to a society and how they can continue working on journalism. And we have carried out workshops. Education is fundamental. When someone goes to a new country, they need to understand how it works and how to do things. But also, we have consulted journalists when it comes to migration and creation of companies. And these doesn't follow the general narrative that we have been speaking at this conference, because it's not about how can I protect them from digital threats or hate speech, but it's about helping them to have a document that will allow them to work, to have some salary that will not put them at risk in this country. So this is not only of the idea of general protection of journalists, but this is also related to a structure of the country that is welcoming them. So we see that the migration process is very complex in Costa Rica. Maybe they're waiting for 3 years to have some shelter, and these are thousands of challenges that, due to time reasons, I cannot share with you. But I would like to finish with this idea that legal assistance is fundamental to prevent the wearing of freedom of press. So if we see these mechanisms and alternatives and these lives that people in power have been using in order to defy what journalists are publishing, so we can have better indicators of what's happening in democratic societies where we respect the state of the law and we have a protection standards for human rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you for such an interesting presentation. And now we will listen to the presentation of Discussive Homogeneity and Discrimination in a Context of Almost Full Freedom of Expression of Alejandra Matus. Wait, don't have my minutes yet. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to save all of the greetings just to have a little bit more time. This brief exposition that I'm going to carry out today synthesizes my knowledge regarding the history of local and world journalism and my experience, which is an invitation to reflect and to see the. But this is not an exposition of conclusions that are definite. To be able to put the presentation in some kind of a consensus, because when we talk about freedom of expression or freedom of thought or freedom of press, media and journalism, there's a lot of ideas that each has in their own heads. So the first thing I wanted to say is that when I talk about journalism in this conference or in this time that I have has to do with the exercise of journalism. I'm thinking about a profession that has evolved over time until it crystallized once advanced in the 20th century. And it is a method of search, verification, and diffusion of relevant information for certain audiences. This methodology, which is practiced in collectives in general, is much more efficient when it's practiced as collectives, and it was strengthened mainly in that century thanks to the advantages that written press had as a preferred vehicle by different entities to be able to contact the same audiences. This historical um, stage allowed the creation of press departments that were robust and that started seeing the different interests that were manifested by the society. And that's why they had ecumenic diaries or newspapers. And Europe, or the English speaking in the last fourth part of the century, and thanks to Watergate, I believe that just at that time we started sharing globally the idea that journalism had a role that was public, and not only as a vehicle of freedom of expression of ideas, but journalism on itself, beyond the debates, ideologies of a society, was key for a democracy to be vibrant. In Chile, we were in dictatorship at that time. So the strengthening of this idea of journalism by the fourth power was interrupted and was not developed. Through decrees, we had been prohibited to have the insistence of any press that was not the official one or controlled by the regime. And also, due to historical issues that we can summarize, that has to do with the international observers, guarantees that there was a transition and there was a system having to do with a democratic, free of the military reign, started as of 88, and also started with the circulation of new newspapers and journals and magazines that were known as opposition. And some radios also, they formed their own press departments, and they also had their own news editorials and talked about human rights violations during this time. They also had different voices that were heard that had been silenced during the first decade of the dictatorship. That's how things looked. That press was not financed with ads, which is something that is very important, but mainly thanks to the cooperation of international funds. And it's important to mention this because these teams had to deal with the censorship and they had to protect their lives and physical and personal integrity from the different intelligence departments of the army, military, or others. And sometimes it, they had to wait 2 months to be able to get their salary because they had not received it yet, but they did not have to think about pleasing those who were the ones that negotiated or those who announced or those who had ads. Those directors did not have anything that was conditioning them regarding who placed different publicity nor the preferences of the audiences that were manifested in social media. At that time, to write a letter, you had to have a typing machine. Somebody had to take it to the mailman, and then they would send it in, and then they would decide whether if it was worth being published or not. So it was always the attention regarding that area. This system, this journalist ecosystem that had the first principles that were already strengthened in the rest of the world, continued existing during the first beginning of the transition to democracy. So in 1990, I dare to state that in 1990, between 1990 and 94, in Chile we had media that was very diverse, where we had those who had supported the regime and those who were sinful and had lied regarding those who had been disappeared, as well as these other that were very strong compared to what they would become afterwards. And is this this crash of the different media alterated the conservative way of being. For example, Mercurio came in with one journalist having to do with the courts, and due to seeing the competition, they ended up having seven. And they would cover the human rights violation, Letelier, and other cases, because if not, they were affected. And this in the journalist practices, this is being affected by this is worse than being censored. So they created this diverse ecosystem that, however, became started dying quite rapidly. It died in part because journalists of those means of the opposition assumed government positions, and because the international source of financing disappeared, and the policy of the state was that the best communication system is the one that doesn't exist. There was no financing from the state through government publicity nor private financing that could help out these different media. They had no, um, they never had the proportion or self financing. So they started dying off. And then by that date, they were all gone. So that same year, Thinking the Unthinkable was printed regarding the death of newspapers as institution. And Chris Anderson spoke regarding this theory of the long tail in digital media. What does this mean? What we have today in the digital Chilean era, I can only talk about Chile because of my experience, but a large amount of offers of voices that use their cell phone or whatever to publish their ideas on internet or different platforms, but a concentration in the head of this serpent, a concentration that is pretty marked by homogeneous ideology and one that is not competing with another. Therefore, they have a freedom to lose all contact with the ethos of the original profession. Therefore, we have less diversity in journalism in a context that is in freedom of press, at least in legal terms, less diversity at the end of the dictatorship, less diversity than at the beginning of the 90s. Journalism has died. There is no press department. There is no funds that are raised. Digital means are not enough to generate our own content. What there is a great diffusion and a huge or great dissemination and great dialogue of opinions with a number of participants that is less and less, where we have the lack of information, misinformation, and lies, not only given by lack of credibility, but also by traditional means.
Thank you for the presentation, and we will finish listening to the presentation of risk and dignity, how AI could and may affect what the media said and show about our practice. From Ignacio Lopez. Hello, thank you very much. As others that have presented in this panel, I'm not going to show a study. I'm just going to ask some questions or reflections. So, from starting from a concept that is used in Chile in recent years, the concept of dignity, but that as a concept has been a very slippery, elusive. And I'm going to read some things that with Maria Teresa, when I sent these slides, which was 2 days ago, I added some other things that are not in the slides, so I would like to read some. And among them, that when we talk about dignity, those that have studied journalism in Chile and in other countries of the world, an author that we end up reading, Carlos Soria, the Spanish author, and he talks about honor. He mentions dignity, and these are things that could be interchangeable. Maybe we can talk about a dignity, but it is not really clear the differences from similar concepts. Even in the speakers that talked today, we talked about dignity, but it's like the concept is there, but it is not really explicit when we talk about topics that I believe are freedom of press and the impact of artificial intelligence in different aspects, included journalism. And in that sense, I couldn't include in this slide was how an author such Albef Arjolan highlights how dignity is the most fundamental need of humans. He says that as part of the many needs that we have, he believes that dignity is the most fundamental one. And he says, well, I consider that dignity is a holistic term, not only the absence of what we should aspire is that people should not be humiliated. It's not only the lack of humiliation as a goal, but also the presence of recognition. It should be a recognition of people with their weaknesses and their strength. So he applies this concept to artificial intelligence, and he proposes nine aspects of dignity. He talks about human rights, security, transparency, justice, accountability. That is very difficult. Well, in general, I think it's accountability that could be translated like that, but innovation, inclusion. And he says that artificial intelligence is impacting these nine points in a positive manner, but it also have some negative impacts, and we need to consider what are those scopes. Due to time, I cannot talk about these nine needs, but I would like to focus on human rights, where the author says, well, something positive of artificial intelligence, thinking about human rights and thinking about the protection of them and being part of dignity, we can monitor and detect human rights violation, maybe adding satellite images or social media content. And he talks about the positive aspects, but he said, sure, but if we talk about monitoring, we're talking about monitoring human behavior, then what happens with technologies such as facial recognition? What's happening, and I'm going to go back to this, but the right to private life. So, up to which point are we talking about a dignity that is impacted? And I would like to add what is going to happen with journalism here. What's going to happen with the journalistic coverage regarding information that we receive that could be related to, and I'm going to mention that after, is about the rights of the image of people and to their private lives. And I'm not saying that this question for private life are new things, and I'm going to go back to that as well. But what happens with this level, this dimension that we are given by artificial intelligence when we investigate topics and the challenges that that implies? And of course, he talks about what happens with data collection at a great scale. That has a very many positive aspects. So this could be making journalism better, but what will happen? Some rights that are involved in that. So my presentation is not about disinformation, but it's very difficult not to make a reference to this. Things that are happening in the world. So we're talking about the upcoming election in the US, and it's going to be a election where artificial intelligence is creating a threat, but we have these challenges. And I wanted to add this as a parallel from what I said before. This information is not a new phenomenon, but technology currently has put it in another level, allows this information to acquire viralization that did not exist before. So artificial intelligence and how can we apply that to journalism also suggests some challenges that are not new. As we talked about, your image to show someone saying or doing something that they never did, that of course is something that has been investigated before. It has been conceptualized. There are literature regarding this. I don't know if there are any students here working on ethics of communication. These are things that we see in that course. We're talking about image, private life, author rights. So even though rights and those attributes is not that we see them just appearing as part of the discussion, I would say what happens with artificial intelligence in terms of what is a journalistic challenge, because in terms of image, that material falsification, it's more difficult to distinguish. The Mexican presenters were talking about deep fakes. So, what is happening with the deep fakes when they are related to something that we need to inform? It is very easy to say that I'm going to see that this is a fake thing, and it's not as easy, and it becomes less easy to understand. So, what happened with private life when this information is related to accessing image of people data? And you can say, of course, this is a part of the information right, but we need to see this case by case, asking some other questions that we need to analyze case by case. But that this distinction could be not really that simple when we think about a hierarchization of image and private life in a context of artificial intelligence that could trans transgress that. And when we think about the university levels, ChatGPT will not be concerned about author's right. We will have a summary, and it could be a very precise summary, but maybe the sources will not be considered. It will not be treated with respect. So when we talk about author's rights, there is a problem of journalism with the attribution of sources. What I investigated, what I informed, am I attributing this in terms of the knowledge where this came from, the images that I obtained? So there is a journalistic challenge in terms of maybe not trusting, and is not a presentation about saying that all artificial intelligence is bad. It's not about that. There are challenges that we need to consider. Well, does that mean that we are facing a new scenario? Yes, we are in a new scenario, and there is a speech. And this was said in a previous panel that there is a speech that we have seen before in journalism, the search of radio, TV, internet, and how that impacted the rest of the media. But this is a new scenario in terms of the capabilities of artificial intelligence and what we can do with it, with generative artificial intelligence. So, do we have new challenges? Not all. I think that the challenges of journalism from an ethical point of view are there. I wouldn't dare to say in its majority, but they are here in a very notorious manner. So we still have the idea of the commitment to truth, and that could go back to Kant. We still have the idea of accountability, such as Max Weber talked about the ethics of accountability. So we talk about journalism and to be conscious about the content that we receive that could be associated to Aristotle's. So in that sense, I would like to say that this new scenario is complex. It leads to many questions, and since I'm a researcher that is associated to ethics, I think that artificial intelligence is a very relevant topic. But what happens is that we are still thinking where should be addressing this. So, as part of all the ethical aspects for artificial intelligence, what we need to start investigating. And I would like to present that the challenges are not really that new. And with this, I'm going to finish my presentation. And I took this from the ethical consultancy of a Gabo Foundation. And we talked about this earlier. I've seen this debate in many ways, but what happens with a new business model that is related to media that talks about a clickbait and showing certain headlines that are kind of confusing. Is this related to artificial intelligence? Not that much, but clearly we are moving in that direction. And the question here is it ethical to use clickbait to obtain views? Well, the answer is very clear, but no. And I would say that if we have these challenges in terms of the model, the economic aspects where media is located, we need to ask as part of that model where we have that accountability that I mentioned before, accountability, awareness, commitment to the truth, that are complex and they've always been complex. So we are facing a scenario where we are still trying to adapt in some unknown scenarios that become this even more uncertain. And I think it's good to consider this accountability and these challenges that are not really that new, and we need to consider that as much as we can. Thank you.
We'd like to thank all of the speakers. They have brought ideas and reflections that are very interesting. We just have a few minutes left to be able to receive a couple questions. We have received quite a few questions, so we're going to have to select just a few. I will read some of the questions, and whoever from the speakers would like to answer would be perfect. The first one is sent very specifically for Dr. Martin Becerra. Is it possible to continue thinking about the possibility of public policies for digital environment in Latin America? Can we go in these public policies? Can we go in that direction? Yes, I would say that more than possible, it's something that we must do to think about public policies in digital environments in other regions of the world. There's already public policy that are active regarding this issue, especially in the three big chapters. One of them has to do with the protection of data of the different users in digital platforms. Now, I know that I don't know all of the different details, but also many of the Latin American countries have these laws, and in many cases, these laws may be a little bit older and need to be adapted due to that they were before the platforms of internet. When I talk about platformation, basically that the existence of platforms and the programming of algorithms of internet based on the extraction of data to personalize, that's one chapter. The other chapter is freedom of expression, contents, moderation of contents, the rules of what can be said on internet, what can be said, what cannot be said, who decides what can be said, what are the limits, what are the sanctions regarding what is said that vulnerates what is established, that has to have be regulated. So the apology of the war speech or discourse is prohibited in many of our countries by the American Convention of Human Rights. However, in many cases, there are presidents in Latin America, I live in Argentina, who have an apology of violence in day to day. Ex President of Bolsonaro, I don't want to go very long, but this is a chapter, a second chapter, freedom of expression and content. It's delicate. Here we are celebrating. I don't want to put the finger in the wound, but the day of a press freedom day has to do with press. We're talking about freedom of expression that has to do with all human beings. And of course, there is a problem of freedom of expression and internet. And they have demands regulations that not be private corporation of Zuckerberg, for example, or Elon Musk or TikTok, who say how much is exhibited of what users and what users are banned or censored. And the third chapter, abuse of dominant position in the market, for example, economic competence. That chapter also requires regulation. In Europe, there are two laws that were that started this year. Uh, the DSA Digital Service Act, DMA Digital Market Act, and this second one has to do with concurrence to avoid the abuse of Facebook and Google in the publicity, for example, that damages traditional means. And in those three chapters, yes, we need legal regulations. We need a Congress to be committed. We are far from that agenda, but I think that it is something that has to be done because if not, the democratic deterioration will be larger. Thank you very much, Doctor. Also for Alejandra Matus. What can we do now regarding the death of journalism? Somebody said buy flowers. Let's go out and take it. Let's go get a drink. No, this is not a problem of the journalists. It's the public function of journalists. It's a problem in society, and therefore I think that the democratic states should take responsibility of the existence and generate the conditions so that we can constitute journalist teams that can try to explain society that is much more complex more and more. Before, journalism was for women by women and by for men by men, sorry. And now we have gone forward, and now there is a society that's much more complex. In women, we have integrated that makes journalism an exercise, a professional exercise that is much more necessary and requires financing. Without material means, it's not going to be possible. Thank you very much. We also have a question for those who are from Mexico, and they ask, it's in English, but if the misinformation and the damage to journalism is common in the, if disinformation plus the damage caused to journalism. I don't know if you could answer those who are connected from Mexico. Of course, yes. The misinformation is effect and cause at times of the polarized environments that prevail in digital spaces and contribute to the hate speeches. And fighting disinformation has turned into one of the most important journalist roles. Up to a decade ago or up to 7 years ago was the last round of the journalist surveys around the world, and we did not ask about disinformation, but clearly journalists see it as a threat, not only to the jurisdiction of their profession, because of course now it means trying to establish their authority as a professional for other players, for example, against YouTubers or influencers, and also the trust or the confidence of their information. uh, Against all fake news. But we have also discovered that the epitome of journalism is fake news and involves a threat for journalists, the way that they can reduce their credibility or to insult practically everything that a journalist published that is being affected or violent or has been a victim of violence or something or that they're calling it fake news. That is affecting the profession in all ways, the identity and the content of his or her work. Thank you very much. And due to times, now we need to finish the panel. However, we would like to encourage all the questions you might have, or the questions might be carried out during the coffee break. And also, we would like to encourage you to continue with the program. We have many new things coming up during the day, so we would like to encourage you to come with us. And we thank all the speakers and participants and everybody who was here today. Thank you very much.